Hello everyone, my name's Andrew Rosser and I'm Professor of Southeast Asian Studies and Deputy Director of the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on making Southeast Asia's education systems work. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This webinar is part of a series associated with Melbourne Asia Review, the Asia Institute's online journal/blog. MAR, as it's known for short, is a quarterly publication which publishes research-based analysis on Asia in an accessible format. Each issue includes a thematic section, and the most recent one focused on the politics of social policy in Asia. This webinar aims to take forward the conversation started by that issue of Melbourne Asia Review with a particular focus on education and Southeast Asia. A lot's been written about Southeast Asia's education systems, but much of it has had a technocratic orientation. Technocratic analysis has tended to understand problems of access and quality in education systems in the region in terms of their proximate causes: inadequate funding, human resource deficits, perverse incentive structures, and poor management. It's accordingly recommended that governments increase funding for the education system, improve teacher training, and reform education administrations. The purpose of this seminar is to shift the analytical focus to a discussion of the political obstacles to and the political possibilities for change. I'm joined in this endeavour by two people with enormous expertise on education and the politics of education within the region, and specifically the cases of Myanmar and the Philippines. Kidjie Saguin is an assistant professor in public policy and governance at the University of Amsterdam. His broad research interest is comparative public policy with a substantive focus on social policy in developing countries. His recent research has been concerned with the question of why the Philippines has achieved radical education policy reforms. He holds a PhD in public policy from the National University of Singapore. Khaing Phyu Htut is the second collaborator on this webinar. She is an education specialist with more than 20 years of professional experience in Myanmar's education sector. She's currently the education advisor for the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in the British Embassy in Myanmar. She's participating in this webinar as a visiting research fellow of the Australian National University and the University of Melbourne. My role in the webinar will be twofold: to speak to the Indonesian case, to bring that into the discussion alongside the case of the Philippines and Myanmar, drawing on research that I've done over the past decade or so on the politics of education in Indonesia. I'll also moderate the discussion. The format for the webinar is for Kidjie Khaing and myself to address a set of questions and hold a discussion about them for around about 30 to 35 minutes. I'll then open things up for broader discussion for Q&A. Please note that there's a Q&A function in the webinar. If you have a question you would like to put forward, please make use of that function. Please don't use the chat function. I'll also note that there is a closed captioning service for this webinar if you would like to use it. So look, with that introduction, let me now start the conversation. Kidjie, let me start with you. Could you please paint a brief picture of the Philippines education system? What are the respective roles of public and private schools? What communities do each serve? What hierarchies exist amongst educational institutions? And what's management of the system like? Is it centralized or decentralized?
Thank you, Andrew, for having me here. The Philippines is actually characterized as a mass private school system in the early 1990s, but we see an increasing trend of deprivatization, where growth in enrollment is focused on public education, while there is still stagnation in the growth of enrollment in private schools. basic education, at least in school year 2021, is predominantly public now, with 93% of enrollment going to public education. And there's increasing gradation in the involvement of private school as you go up the higher the levels of education, which accounts for 37% of senior high school. We don't know exactly the demographics of students who go to private schools, but we expect them to really have a higher income than most public school students. This is quite clear in the distribution of private schools in the country, where you would find private schools dominating regions that have higher GDP. For instance, in the National Capital Region in the Philippines, 76% of senior and junior high school students are private. Similarly, in a region in Luzon called Calabarzon, 63% of senior and junior high schools are private. So it is safe to say that private schools generally cater to higher income households, and more impoverished regions are catered to by public schools. And there's generally a preference for private schools. More recently, an analysis showed that private schools who participated in PISA actually outperformed much of their public school counterparts. And this corroborated by long-standing research about the relative quality of education in private schools. But it must be noted that not all private schools are created equal. Smaller non-sectarian schools are often known for its poor quality than their sectarian or more religious counterpart, owing to this long historical development of private sectarian schools since the colonial period. So generally the approach has been to govern it through national government. It's a service that's not really decentralized. So it's a very centralized governance where a lot of decisions are made at the top.
All right, thanks, Kidjie. Khaing, could you paint a picture of the education system for us in Myanmar as well, along similar parameters?
Thanks. Yes, I should first start by saying that Myanmar is not in a comparable situation with Indonesia or the Philippines, politically, socio-economically, or in education. State or government is the key provider of education in Myanmar. If we look at the total student body, 92% of students, they go to public schools or government schools. And then 8% they go to ethnic education systems and private schools. So ethnic education systems are offered by ethnic groups in their own regions. And then the amount of student body will be like 0.5 to 1% of the total student body. So it's quite small in comparison at the moment. And if we look at the private education, there can be two key types. The first type is international private schools, which use international curriculum, not the government's one. And they serve mainly the elites. And the second type, they use a government curriculum. And then for them, the key customers are upper middle class people. So in terms of hierarchy, if we think of hierarchy in terms of quality and resources, international schools and private schools, they are at the top. And if you ask about centralizations, Myanmar education system has always been criticized for being too centralized. There were reform efforts made in the past, but the most comprehensive enough reform was experienced between 2011 and 2020. So there were like 10 years of education reform periods amidst many years of neglected and underinvestment in education. However, you know, the reform period was not we lost the hopes of our reform period. First, because of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, and then secondly, with far worse impact because of the military coup in February 2021. So after that, we lost international coordination. We also lost hopes of autonomy or inclusion or better resources and better education. So one example is that after that, like 5 million students, they were not in public schools anymore. The usual figure was like 9.7 million children attending schools in 2020. And in 2021, the figure dropped to like 5 million. Now the number has crept back to 6 million, but millions of children are still missing out on education. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Khaing. Look, as far as Indonesia is concerned, I'm seeing some key differences actually in the very structure of the education systems in the three countries that we're looking at in this webinar, with regards to the respective role of public and private and the sorts of social hierarchies that are reflected in the respective roles of public and private schools. Perhaps the first thing I should say about Indonesia's education system, though, is that it's a massive system. Estimates of the number of students, number of teachers, number of schools varies depending on the source of data that one looks at, but commonly used figures are that the system educates 50 million students, employs about 3 million teachers, and involves the work of around about 300,000 schools. Public schools are the dominant element in the education system, but there is a very large private school system. Some of those private schools service the elite and are located in large urban areas with substantial middle classes and elite populations. But Indonesia also has an extensive private school system that services the poor. The public school system occupies a sort of middle strata in the system, and one of the reasons for this quite different sort of structure in the Indonesian case is that public education historically has been underprovided, which has created both an opportunity and a need for private actors to get in at the bottom end of the educational market, so that kids from relatively poor backgrounds can get an education as well. Key players at that end of the market are the major Islamic organisations, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, both of which oversee extensive education networks. In contrast to both the Philippines and Myanmar, Indonesia has now a relatively decentralized system of education management. Back in New Order days, New Order was the name of the authoritarian government that ruled Indonesia from the mid-60s to the late 90s. Back then, things were very centralized, but with the fall of the New Order and the shift towards a more democratic and decentralized political system, education management has been decentralized largely down to the district level. Indonesia has over 500 districts, so it's down to a relatively small unit of administration. The key exception in that respect is higher education. So, all right, so we've painted a picture of the education systems that we're working on respectively. Kidjie, let me come back to you. How would you rate the performance of the Philippines education system with regards to access to education and quality and learning? What, as you see it, are the main challenges in each case?
In terms of access, like in terms of looking at only at net enrollment rate, it's pretty good. And it has been growing since 2017. In junior high school, this grew from 76 to 81 in 2020, with an expected kind of dip during COVID times. Net enrollment rate for elementary schools dipped to 89 actually, with some signs of recovery. And what's interesting with this dip is that historically, elementary education has had good amounts of enrollment, mainly because of this colonial history with the US, which focused on mass education at the elementary level. So that's why a lot of the discussions about improving access has been limited or focused on the high school or the junior and the senior high school level. We know for a fact that more female students, as in most developing countries, are enrolled than male students. Performance in terms of access across regions is also related to income, with more prosperous regions outperforming less prosperous regions. Net enrollment rate, for example, in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Mindanao is actually at the 30% level, which is significantly lower than most of the regions in the country. So access is pretty good, but enrollment figures hides a lot of information about the quality of infrastructure. A figure 10 years ago suggests that 31% of public schools are overcrowded. But it also suggests that there's an issue of improper distribution of resources, because 15% of these schools were also deemed to be undersubscribed. In other words, it's not getting enough students. Recent studies suggest that classroom construction has actually been outpacing student growth, with classroom student ratio going down to around 1:29 from 1:39 in elementary schools. Much work is needed to improve access to key water and hygiene facilities at school level. For instance, the Philippines is a laggard in providing basic potable water to its schools, with 30% of schools as having no water service at all. So while access seems to be good, the actual quality of the infrastructure to deliver educational services is actually pretty bad. And this can be linked to really this terrible performance in quality and learning. We find severe shortcomings in achieving the goals for education quality and learning. In 2019, the World Bank estimated that 91% of children in the Philippines suffer from learning poverty, or that they are unable to read and understand a simple text by 10 years old, which is significantly higher than its peers in the region. Indonesia, for example, is at 53% of poverty rate, Thailand is 23%, and Myanmar is at 89%. So while Khaing Phyu was suggesting that it's not comparable, but actually we're severely underperforming than Myanmar in terms of the quality. This suggests that the learning crisis is deep and has been going on for a long time. PISA puts Philippines at the second poorest performing country. Many of our students are below proficiency in math, English, and science. And this is something the government already knows way in advance than the PISA findings. Our national achievement tests, which doesn't really get its media coverage at all, sixth grade students put the overall mean scores at 40 in 2016, which is a significant drop, 2016, which is a significant drop from 69 in 2014. And we need essentially a better way of managing our resources in the sense that it has a link to our connection to improving quality and learning. For instance, the major hurdles to improving teaching quality is the fact that teachers do not really spend their time teaching. Most of them are burdened by administrative tasks. Some even end up working on the library or managing the canteen and implementing different programs, such as the conditional cash transfer. And essentially what teachers do is not really deliver the services of the educational system. Rather, they're expected to deliver the entire social system, the function of the social system of integrating health, nutrition, good values, right conduct, alongside with sort of monitoring the conditionalities, whether students actually fulfill the conditionalities for the cash transfer. So a lot of the problems that are linked to this long-standing education crisis is really based on inefficient management of resources that we have. And there's been so much calls on increasing the education funding, which is true, it's really below regional levels. But there are a lot of gaps in improving how we currently manage the resources, because, for example, the government's not really utilizing the budget effectively and efficiently. And there's just a lot of hurdles in terms of the implementation of the existing programs that make improvement of learning and education very difficult.
Khaing, how do you see the performance of Myanmar with regards to access, quality, and learning?
Yes, I found a lot of similarities in what Kidjie talked about in terms of inefficiencies. Yes, the enrollment rate is quite okay. And then in terms of the union level gender index as well, there is not really gender bias, but there are regional disparities hidden by those figures. And if we look at Myanmar education, I think we are at the very basic stages. We are still at the very basic stages of, meeting access and quality requirements. And for us on access, dropout is a very serious issue even before the pandemic and the political crisis, because we about 12 million school-age children we have, and 2 million, they have never been to school, they never go to school. So now that figure is, greatly increased by the crisis. It will be like, it could be like 6 million, like half of the children in Myanmar are not learning. So I think access is a very serious issue for Myanmar. And then in terms of quality, for quality to have, we need to have reasonable investment. When there is no reasonable investment in education, it is very hard to think about having quality. And before 2011, the percentage of GDP spent on education is less than 1% in Myanmar, so like 0.7%. So it slowly crept to higher levels during 2011 and 2020. And in 2020, the last figure was 2.9%. So it was reasonable enough, but at the same time, not sufficient at all to address the gaps that we have suffered all throughout. And in 2020, if we look at the Human Development Index of Myanmar, we are at 147 out of 180 countries. That was in 2020. So with the crisis now, the situation could be far worse. And when we look at the state budget for education, the budget is kept the same, like 2020 figure. But we are a country which is suffering from economic crisis, like prices going up threefold, with the government budget staying the same. So many of the teachers are dissatisfied. So when their basic needs are not met, they are not able to think about quality. So the key challenges that we are facing right now are not really directly related to education, but influencing education a lot. The first is like the political instability. The second is divide and distrust among education stakeholders, among teachers, among parents, among students because of the political crisis. And we don't have international collaboration anymore because donor countries, they don't want to engage with Myanmar. And the fourth is also a very important thing. We have very low number of teachers at the moment. So after the crisis, 50% of higher education teachers, they left their service. And like 1/3 of basic education teachers, they left their service. So the state system, who has always been the majority of the provider of education, is struggling with lack of teachers and lack of qualified teachers. And the last but definitely not the least is in this modern and IT age, our schools, our universities, they are very much short of, modern resources. We don't have computers, we don't have Wi-Fi, we don't even have power. So that's why, if we are to make Southeast Asia education systems work, Myanmar might be quite tricky. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Khaing. That's a comprehensive, if rather depressing, picture that you've just painted. A more optimistic one from Kidjie. I mean, my sense is that the Indonesian case broadly parallels the Philippine experience. Indonesia's made some really significant gains in terms of improving access to education. Things were disrupted quite considerably, of course, by COVID-19. Schools were closed for roughly 2 years, and whether students were able to cope with those closures depended very much on their access to mobile phones, computers, internet access, that sort of thing. And that was really quite varied across the country by socioeconomic status and by region. In terms of overall participation in the education system, according to the most recent figures that the Central Bureau of Statistics has, the participation rate at primary school level is 99%, at junior secondary level 95%, and the senior secondary school level 73%. So Indonesia's been doing pretty well in terms of actually getting kids into school, and that performance has improved significantly over time. We'll have to see what the impact of COVID-19 ends up being. There have certainly been reports of increased rates of students dropping out as a result of the pandemic. But I don't think we have a clear picture at the present as to the impact of COVID-19 in that respect. The story for Indonesia with regards to quality is quite different. Whilst Indonesia's been able to get kids into school and keep them in school for longer, they haven't necessarily been learning more as a result. Qualitative assessments of the quality of Indonesia's education system typically characterise standards as fairly poor. Indonesia participates in PISA, TIMSS and PEARLS, the main international standardized assessments of learning, and it has done for roughly 20 years now. The country's results in those international tests suggest that learning outcomes have not improved significantly, and that's despite, not just improvements in terms of participation rates, but also significantly increased spending on the part of the Indonesian government on the education system following changes to the constitution in the late 90s, early 2000s, which enshrined an obligation on the government to spend at least 20% of its budget on education. So the increased resources going into education have not necessarily, do not appear to have translated into improved learning outcomes. The World Bank did an analysis in the latter half of 2021 where it tried to measure the learning impact of COVID-19, and it assessed the impact of the pandemic as leading to a loss of learning of around about 1 year. As I recall, the exact figures were in the range of 0.9 to 1.2 years of learning. Look, let's turn now to strategies and initiatives that governments in the three countries we're looking at have employed to try and improve access, to try and raise quality and improve learning outcomes. Kidjie, let me come back to you. What have been the government's main initiatives with regards to these objectives? And let's try and bring the politics in as well. What has driven these initiatives? What interests have backed them, and what interests have resisted these initiatives, and what have been the outcomes as a result?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. In the past 10 years, there's been massive system-wide reforms on education, which would involve like universal kindergarten, ensuring that there's universal access to kindergarten, public kindergarten schools, the K-12 enhanced basic education program, or the law was enacted to add the 2 years in senior high school to improve the transition to college and world of work, and also to address some levels of congestion in the curriculum. There's this mother tongue-based multilingual learning education that's currently happening, although it's very divisive and very political at this point, where the Congress is trying to reverse this reform, where we tried to introduce mother tongue education in the first 3 years of education, because it's seen as a better way to transition from early childhood to primary education. But what's quite interesting, the past few years are really more proposals and like very recent reforms. The first one is what they would call now as the National Learning Recovery Program. So this is a way to address this learning crisis that is happening, or this massive learning poverty. And essentially, this is a voluntary enrichment and remedial course that's going to be implemented at the level of the schools, which would involve this idea, what they call the national learning camp. The key challenge to this is to really overcome issues encountered by similar bridging programs, because usually this is going to be a summer program. And in the past, there are issues of stigma to students who would participate in these kinds of programs because they're seen as, need more help, needing more time to study. And a lot of parents actually hated the idea, or that there's stigma to participation in these kinds of bridging programs. So I think this is the main issue that needs to be confronted by such intervention. But there is an interesting dynamic to it. It's a centralized program, but it's expected to be implemented by the schools. And there is no clear financing of this program. So people are expected, or the schools are expected, to get the funding out of their existing budget. And this goes back to this kind of approach to reforms by the bureaucracy, where there's heavy centralization in terms of policy direction, and they would decentralize certain functions that they deemed are more important, but it's really based on the fact that the central government could not finance it. So it's basically a decentralizing function without decentralizing financing and even accountability. So this goes back to the criticism of the Department of Education's culture for, a policy by memo, or the culture of obeisance, where they set policies and they expect all the lower levels of the government to follow. So there's not a lot of thinking around the idea of a more decentralized approach to implementing this National Learning Recovery Program. The second one is really more of a proposition that I think reflects a lot of the politics of education reforms in the Philippines. A lot of stakeholders, including politicians themselves, the senators, are calling to expand subsidy programs for private schools. Right now, cash aid is given directly to private schools, and they cover about 84% of private school students at the junior high school level, and 93% of private senior high school students. And at least in 2017, we know that more than 50% of private junior high schools participate or actually receive subsidies. And there are even instances of schools receiving almost 80 to 90% of their budget from subsidies. So they're heavily reliant on subsidies to actually just exist. So much of this suggestion is predicated on making the state live up to its constitutional mandate for public-private partnership. But the subsidy is really a result of lobbying of private schools with the US government and former Marcos government in the 1970s. This points to the idea that any education reform should entail working with the private schools, who are the ones who are actually at the losing end of public school expansion. So we're now seeing expansion of subsidies alongside the expansion of public state education. And it's a way to really compensate private schools to prevent crowding out effect, which has happened in elementary education. And whether this is ideal, whether this should be done, is not really the subject of political debate. It's seen as important, it's seen as natural. But a lot of the research suggests that private schools are not really performing much better than public schools in terms of catering to the poor and deserving students. There's also this idea of the subsidy program as decongesting public schools, but we don't have any evidence of this happening. In fact, there is a maldistribution of the subsidies to, again, richer regions of the Philippines. So there is a large amount of private sector lobbying that needs to be confronted by any form of education reform. So this, like usually the reforms that we are going to implement are much more costlier than we would imagine.
Okay, thanks, Kidjie. Over to you, Khaing. How are things playing out in Myanmar? What are the main initiatives, and what is the politics around them?
Yes, sorry for painting a very negative and depressing scenario, but we did have education reform plans, and then we did have the comprehensive education sector review, which reviewed all the education sectors from 2012 to 2014. And then subsequently, we developed National Education Strategic Plan 1, which lasted for 5 years. And then we were about to embark on the phase 2 in February 2021. But, you know, it's like people are still trying. For the development partners as well, they are also trying to walk from where they are. And it is an interesting picture because these national education strategic plans were collaborated together between Ministry of Education and development partners. Now they were separated and then each marching on in its own way with varying degrees of results. So the Ministry of Education, we cannot also ignore the fact that it is still at the center of education. It is still providing access to like 92% of students. And then for the development partners, they have come up with a joint response framework, which is, you know, to support 2 million, the most marginalized children. So there are works, you know, there are good works as well. And I think for the education, it's unfortunate that it is caught in the politics. And then as Kidjie mentioned, private sector is booming in Myanmar because of the crisis. It's like just in last year, there has been a double-fold increase in the private schools number. So we used to have like 2,000 private schools and then now 3,700 just in 1 year. But it is not enough because it is very small fraction of the provision. So it could be more than that. So compared to the national coverage, it's like private sector is covering 5 to 8%. So it could be definitely doing more. But at the same time, we need to be careful with private schools who are very much business oriented. So there have been feedback from teachers who work in the private education sector that they don't really care for the children's benefits or the outcomes, but just by making money. And then there are also private education coming in dubious nature. And then they said there are affiliations with which and which university, which and which schools, but actually they are not true. So parents are suffering because they don't have much choice if they don't want to stay at school anymore. So I think that there should be strategies to look at private education to be more effective. And then there should be support for low-cost private education. And I think for the Ministry of Education, they also recognize that many children are not with their schools anymore. So they are trying to improve on access, quality, and relevancy of curriculum to life. But at the same time, with little support and then with little resources, we don't know what the outcomes will be. So most of the Myanmar experts, they have been speculating that if we go on like this, the outcome can be growing gap and inequalities between students who can access private education and who has to go to state education only. And then between rural and urban as well, especially in conflict areas where children cannot learn, they will be out of the picture. So if we, I think for an education reform or any strategy to take place, all stakeholders have to be working together. We are not in a position. So I think this is the most difficult challenge. Thanks.
All right, thanks Khaing. Look, in the Indonesian case, there have been actually a whole array of initiatives aimed at trying to improve either access to education or equality and learning outcomes. The education sector has been an incredibly active space in that respect on the policy front, and also in terms of the politics, because a whole variety of initiatives have been taken, and there's been pushback one way or another against virtually all of them, with varying outcomes. Some reform initiatives have managed to stick, and others have not. I mentioned a moment ago the fact that constitutional reform saw obligations imposed on the Indonesian government to spend at least 20% of its budget on education. That has not changed as policy, and in fact the government has moved over time to meet that constitutional obligation. It took a while to get there, but it did eventually get there, and it's maintained a level of spending consistent with that with that obligation. There has been some pushback against that, though, and it's taken the form of efforts to try and incorporate into the 20%, the way in which the 20% is calculated, a whole array of expenditures that some would argue, in fact, don't properly belong in the education budget, including, for instance, training programs run by government ministries. There was quite a bit of argy-bargy over the question of whether teachers' salaries should be included in the 20% or not, or that requirement should only relate to non-salary related expenditures. In the end, that was settled in favour of a view that the 20% should include salaries. Another sort of key policy issue, an area of reform that's been around free basic education. Free basic education has officially been policy for a long, long time in Indonesia, since at least sometime in the 1970s, but it's never really been fully implemented, and a whole array of supporting programs and so on were never put in place to make it a reality. There's been widespread charging of both legal and illegal fees within the Indonesian education system for a long time. Following the fall of the new order, though, the Indonesian government did move to try and implement free basic education in a more serious way, and introduced a system of school grants, school-based management, and other supporting policies to try and make that a reality. And the policy is certainly stuck, and district governments have gotten on board, provincial governments as well, with additional financial support to try and make that a reality. The less successful reforms have been around institutional autonomy. There are a series of initiatives to try and give schools and universities greater autonomy. A lot of pushback from a whole variety of different interests to reforms in that respect. And the outcome so far seems to be some progress in terms of realising greater institutional autonomy at the university level, but much less so at the school level. Teachers, trying to improve teacher quality, subject knowledge, performance, attendance. There have been a whole array of initiatives in that respect, most of which have failed to yield much in terms of results, at least according to the evidence that we have so far. Most famously, the government introduced a teacher certification program that basically doubled teachers' salaries. Well, it was accompanied with moves to double teachers' salaries, and the idea was that in exchange for greater pay, teachers would go through a certification program that improved their subject knowledge and pedagogical skills. Assessments of that program have suggested that teachers managed to get away with a doubling of their salaries without in practice actually achieving much in terms of improved skills and subject knowledge. There were also efforts to introduce a high stakes national exam, something that the philosophy at the time was that basically if the bar got raised in terms of student progression, it would incentivize parents and students to work harder and perform better. That had a whole series of negative results in terms of student progression, access to continuing education, and so on, and suffered an enormous amount of pushback, in particular from middle class and human rights groups and so on, and they managed to defeat that policy. So the picture is very, very mixed in terms of the outcomes on the reform front. All right, look, we've got 15 minutes left, so I might wrap up the sort of presentation part of or conversation part of the webinar and move to the Q&A. We have a set of questions. The first one, Kidjie, is for you, and it's from Benita. And her question is, what role do intergovernmental organisations such as USAID, DFAT, etc., play in relation to education reform in the Philippines? What's their agenda, and what has been the impact of their involvement?
Thanks for this question. I think I could talk more about my experience in helping with the K-12 reforms. And one of the things I realized there is that there's a huge amount of autonomy in determining where technical grants can go to. And a lot of this has been on hiring consultants to help in the technical aspects of the reform, which is very crucial in institutions building. And I think I will pivot to more of the speculative element of thinking about the roles of international organizations, that I would harp on the idea of improving the analytical capacity of the education bureaucracy. The Department of Education is very good in doing education research, but not really on research on improving, for example, management or improving how things are done in terms of implementing reforms. So there is a good amount of space where they can better commission research. EDB is to some extent doing this, but also improving information about performance at the school level. There are already some information management systems, but analysis and research could actually be improved. So funding on this could really improve how the education is governed. I think a second point that I wanted to make is really for these kinds of interorganizational, intergovernmental bodies to deliver funding or improve the salience of underfunded areas. One of which is early childhood education. Kindergarten is heavily underfunded, despite the fact that there is universal education. And we need more funding, more research, more people to actually work on early childhood education. And lastly, there's really a need to focus on improving governance. And in particular, the government needs help in improving how to procure resources, because the main issue is that a lot of the procurement are decentralized. I think some people are asking that in the Q&A, but there's no market, for example, for books or for stationaries, for computers at the most rural areas. So improving procurement is something that will actually improve the management of resources that we currently have.
Thanks, Kidjie. Look, there's a question from Kathy, which is directed to all the panelists, but Khaing, I might get you to speak to this one in relation to Myanmar specifically. And the question is, in terms of the effect of politics on the outcomes of education, what is the most significant political element that is holding things back?
I think how much the power holders would like to prioritize education. So, and then what type of education they would like to foster. Because Myanmar has been labeled as quite a restricted country in the past with very limited curriculum. And the education is blamed for making people complacent and then accepting to conditions. So I think, you know, the power holders, they might want to maintain that, or they might want to change it. So I think this is the priority of how will they prioritize it, and then what sort of education they would like to support. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Khaing. There's a question in the Q&A for me about the election next year in Indonesia and its implications for education. Everyone, of course, is very focused on the election, the presidential election next year. Look, my guess is that it won't have a massive impact in terms of the broad direction of things. My sense is that broadly across Indonesia's political elite, there is recognition that if Indonesia is going to escape the middle income trap, if it's going to get into the industries of the future, if it's going to participate in the knowledge economy, it needs a better education system. Some of the rhetoric around that idea, I think, might change depending on exactly who it is who becomes president. But you know, Joko Widodo, for instance, has really like to sort of link Indonesia's education challenges to participation in the knowledge economy and Industry 4.0 and so on. He has his particular buzzwords that he likes to emphasize, and they may not have such prominence in the future. But my sense is that the top levels of Indonesia's political elite, there is actually a broad recognition that things need to change. The key challenge for them is being able to drive that change from the top down in a context where district governments really hold the whip hand, because they're formally responsible for education, and they respond to very, very different sorts of political dynamics. On the one hand, the central government really doesn't have too many levers it can pull to try and get district government to fall into line with central government directives. On the other hand, at the local level, there aren't necessarily well-organized interest groups trying to push for improvements in education quality and learning outcomes. Let me go back to the Q&A. There are a few questions here. Look, there's one here about funding for education and its implications. The question is where funding is increased without improvements to educational outcomes, would the panelists speculate on the reasons why this might be? I mean, that's a question that I can see might relate specifically to the Indonesian case. But Kidjie or Khaing, would you like to have a go at answering that question?
Yeah, so I think increasing education funding in most cases is very difficult, but it's a low-hanging fruit in the sense that it's probably the easiest thing to achieve. But we know for a fact that there's a huge bottleneck in translating funding to actual delivery of services. And I have three things that I have in mind based on the Philippine experience. First is this really maldistribution of resources. And I think I just want to go back to a point that you raised, Andrew. There's a lot of discussion now about increased intelligence fund in the education budget. Around 150 billion pesos is proposed to be included as intelligence fund, and we don't know for a fact how that will translate to actual improvement in education services. So while funding is increasing, we don't know where it's actually directed at improving learning outcomes. The second one is really absorptive capacity. So the more you bring money to a fairly rigid bureaucracy, and there's a lot of path dependency in how things are spent, but the more you expand it, the expectation is they would easily spend it, but it's actually not. There's an instance of school-based management reforms in the Philippines where they decentralized funding to schools, and what they realized is like schools don't have accountants, schools don't have finance officers, and actually use the money and liquidate the money in a way that is based on government accounting. And there's a lot of unaccounted money at this point because they can't do it and they can't find it anymore, right? So there's that issue of decentralizing functions without capacity. And I think generally there's a lot of issues with implementation because in a fairly centralized bureaucracy, you would expect that they would be more agile at actually using budget, but actually it's not. It's a very rigid bureaucracy that doesn't really know how to spend the new resources. Even previous resources not really well spent. So there's really an issue of translating budget to implementation.
Thanks, Kidjie. Khaing, have you got a view in relation to that question?
Yes, I agree with most of Kidjie's point. Funding is just one tiny aspect of improvement. And in Myanmar as well, I would just like to add something Kidjie hasn't talked about much. It's about teachers. They are always at the receiving end. And then, as the system has been so centralized, people in the regions, they have been quite passive. So without capacity building for them as well, just improving the funding alone, we can't achieve outcomes. Thanks.
Okay. Look, in the Indonesian case, as I said, there has been this massive increase in education spending, and at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily seem to have yielded much by way of improvements in quality or learning. I gather from the studies I've read, particularly out of the World Bank office in Jakarta, that a lot of the increased spending has gone into the pay rises for teachers that were linked to the teacher certification program. Quite a bit of the money has gone into a school grant system aimed at supporting free basic education and school-based management. In the former case, the key thing was that there was really significant pushback from the teachers' trade union, the PGRI, in relation to the element of the teacher certification program that tried to impose some accountability on teachers, and they were able to basically get that accountability component of the certification program watered down to the point where it became virtually inconsequential. So rather than having to demonstrate genuine improvements in skills and subject knowledge, etc., things came to center on the preparation of a portfolio, which at one point you could basically buy on a street corner, photocopy, and then submit. So the whole process got corrupted, and it got corrupted in large part because of the political weight of the Indonesian teachers union. I mean, the PGRI is an actor that hasn't received a lot of attention in studies of Indonesian politics, but it's a really significant actor in the education space. With the school grants program, the issue there has been that a lot of the money has gone into employing additional teachers, in particular on an honorary or casual basis. The teachers haven't necessarily been terribly well qualified. They've often been friends or family members of school principals and the like. There's been a lot of concern on the part of anti-corruption groups about corruption in that particular program. So it's the problems there are a combination of the political weight of key actors, poor checks and balances in the way in which certain monies have been managed, and so on. Look, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I might just pass things back to Khaing and Kidjie and just ask for your final comments, really in relation to what should be done from here on in to improve access and enhance quality. 30-second answers, please.
Yes.
Khaing, to you first.
Yes, for us, a wide scale of far-reaching reform programs cannot be started at the moment because of political feasibility. So we should be thinking about accelerated learning programs and then supporting kids who are not in schools anymore. So international community support is very.
Kidjie?
I really advocate for improving the governance of education. So two things. First is really improve the existing distribution of resources, incentivize teachers and school administrators to go to remote areas, for example, improve teachers' workload by hiring more support staff and building a cadre of school administrators. The second point is really devolve certain functions alongside capacity. So if you're going to devolve, the use of resources of money, you should also devolve some forms of financial management as well.
Interesting. Yeah, look, I think the conclusion I've come to in relation to Indonesia is that actually a degree of re-centralization may be necessary, particularly around authority over teacher management issues. The politics of education policy making at the national level is different to the local level for the reasons that I indicated before. There's much greater influence from technocratic and progressive elements at the national level than at the local level, and so re-centralizing some functions may open up greater opportunity for actors of a different sort of persuasion that are more sort of pro-learning in their orientation to influence policy and its implementation if things get re-centralized a bit. Another thing would be for the central government to actually deliver on threats to district governments in relation to education policy issues. I didn't get a chance to talk about teacher redistribution, but the central government has in the past threatened to impose certain penalties on district governments, but then balked at actually doing so if they didn't deliver on objectives in relation to teacher redistribution. And finally, since local governments are key actors in relation to education, there's got to be some work done to build coalitions at the local level so that there are voices at the local level advocating for improved outcomes in terms of quality and learning. All right, look, I think we need to draw things to a close now. That's been, I think, a really productive and fascinating discussion. Kidjie and Khaing, thank you very much for being involved this evening. It's, as I said, really terrific, and I see there are lots of clapping hands appearing on the screen. So I think our audience has been appreciative of the opportunity to talk these things through. So, look, finally, let me say thanks to the audience for joining us today. I hope you've learned something and garnered a few thoughts about how we might be able to take things forward in the education space in Southeast Asia. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you too. Bye.
Goodbye.